Well, speaking of Jefferson Airplane, now you make the point that the 60s has, this undisputed reputation as a golden age of music, well, with the Beatles and the other British invasion bands, Bob Dylan, Motown, Jimi Hendrix, etc. And meanwhile, the 70s, tends to be more maligned and dismissed and ridiculed. It's like you just point at the polyester leisure suit and say, that's the 70s, that's all of it, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But as we all know, not only was there, equally amazing music being made in that decade, but many of the artists, as you also point out, who got started in the 60s actually peaked creatively in the 70s. Think of Paul Simon, The Who, Rolling Stones, Stevie Wonder. I'm sure all of them preferred their 70s output to their 60s. And, likewise, Joni Mitchell, David Bowie, Elton John, Steely Dan, their prime years for all those people was the 70s.
Yeah, and I think it's just it's a lazy habit, and maybe it's the iron hand of the baby boom. Maybe they're in charge of all the rock magazines or something, but it just became a thing of, well, the 70s were goofy and the 60s were great. Well, Surf and Bird happened in the 60s, and some pretty intense, amazing stuff happened in the 70s. So, careful to not paint everybody with one brush, because like you said, I mean, if you're a Rolling Stones fan, I don't know about you, but I would put Sticky Fingers and Exile up against Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed any day.
We're not saying the 60s stuff was bad. We're just saying that the 70s stuff, they had progressed.
It's comparable, yeah. And I mean, there's freestanding stuff that didn't exist in the 60s that started during those years, like, reggae and funk. Apart from James Brown, there really wasn't funk until those years, and then it really took off and exploded at that time.
Absolutely. As you also pointed out, a lot of 70s songs resurfaced in the 80s. You had Oh Girl, If You Don't Know Me By Now, Higher Ground. So there must have been some value to the material if it was, redone in the 80s. I can't think of a single case where it was done better, where the remake was better, unfortunately. But I'm just saying that the songs themselves reappeared, and if it would have been, a crap decade, that wouldn't have happened. You make the point in the book that just because the calendar said it's 1970 and 71 now, it doesn't mean that all the artists who started in the 60s are suddenly going to say, oh, I got to completely change my style. A lot of the music in the early 70s was just a continuation of the 60s. And one interesting statistic you cited was that between 1966 and 1970, a total of 13 artists accounted for every number one hit. And if you think about it, 13 is not that many, and that's over a 5-year period.
Right.
And then in the following 5 years, the number one spot was held by 28 different artists, which was more than double. So as we already said, the 70s were a wider field in that regard.
Yeah, I actually did that little bit of research, which was no small chore. And it was one of those things where you feel like that's true, and then you actually do the research and it bears you out and you go, oh, okay, so I was right about that. It's more than just a feeling. It's sort of like, the Beatles and the Supremes and the Stones and all those bands really did rule the 60s, and they're, at the top of the chart anyway. There wasn't a lot of room for anything else. And then if you look at any given year from 71 to 75, it's just a fantastic variety show, which is actually a tribute to how open-ended Top 40 was at the time. They'd play Edgar Winter next to Charlie Rich, and then, Aretha Franklin next to Aerosmith. There was no kind of formatting going on in the sense that it goes on now.
I know, which is much better. I mean, it's life's rich tapestry, like why say, okay, we do this, and this is all we do, and if you do anything else but this, don't listen to our station, or don't advertise here, go away. Or you roll something silly like a novelty song, and then I totally kind of miss that. I don't know if it'll come back. Well, in a way, it kind of has. Podcasting is like niche radio, and we do things in podcasting that you can't really do with terrestrial radio or a commercial model. But even so, that era was unique in that regard, and it's kind of a shame, but, like George Harrison said, all things must pass.
All things must pass, that's right. And, I listen to more podcasts than I listen to radio, and I certainly listen to more podcasts than I watch TV these days because of what you just said, the specificity of it. You can get right into the subject at hand with like-minded people and not worry about whether it's palatable to every household in America. It's a great thing in a way, but it was also forecasted by all the futurists back in the early 70s. They said as soon as the technology gets to the point where we can narrowcast to small groups of people, that's exactly what's going to happen, and you won't have, you effectively won't have a mainstream anymore. You'll just have, everything will be a niche. And look at Sirius XM radio. That's what that is. If you only want to hear one decade's worth of music, or in some cases one artist's worth of music, you can just dial up that station and you're going to get exactly what you're looking for. The only problem is it's a closed system. Yeah. You're never going to be surprised or tickled by some new thing that you haven't heard before.
And it removes the whole concept of a Wolfman Jack or a DJ personality, because they give you your playlist, tell you what to play. Where's your input?
Yeah, well, and I've championed that idea over the years with a lot of people in a lot of different drunk and sober discussions. Just the idea that the top 40 being a crazy, unregulated variety show is far superior to it being run by test groups or consultants out of the head office in wherever it is.
Yeah, it's supposed to be art. It's not supposed to be the mall.
Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
Well, here in the U.S., we're accustomed to thinking of ourselves as the center of the universe and our record charts as the definitive tally. But, a unique attribute of your book is with you and your brother both being Canadian, you had your own charts and your own artists, although there was bound to be a lot of crossover. I really enjoyed the chapter you did about the mandatory Canadian content. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, that's something that maybe a lot of Americans wouldn't know, but it's actually something that Canada has in common with a lot of kind of medium-sized Western countries. The story in Australia was actually very similar, where they came in and said, we have to sort of create some infrastructure for our culture to matter. And so in Canada, in the broadcast world, they just brought in a 30% Canadian content rule, and overnight there was all this demand for original Canadian music, and so the whole industry sprung up around that. Studios, major labels started having offices north of the border, and within about 5 years you had all kinds of long-term careers that used to be just local or regional careers taking advantage of that. In fact, Ian Thomas, who's on our Breithaupt Brothers record, that's one of those. Just kind of that might have been Painted Ladies might have been a hit in Toronto, but suddenly it was on the radio everywhere, and then eventually it becomes a story, and then it comes out in the U.S. and Bob's your uncle. But it took someone with the imagination to say, I know this doesn't seem fair right now, but believe me, it's going to work. And there's an incredible wealth of Canadian stuff that's happened globally since then that might not have gotten its taken its first baby steps without that legislation. And I think the story's the same in Australia and a bunch of European countries too, because we're all fighting it's always a David and Goliath thing with the USA and to some extent with England.
Yeah, it's funny because Ian Thomas, Dave Thomas and Rick Moranis on SCTV had this thing where they were told that they needed to have more a certain amount of Canadian content. Maybe they were satirizing it, but they said, what do you mean Canadian content? Well, you want us to put on some toques and fry up back bacon and drink beer? And they go, yeah, something like that. and then right. That was Bob and Doug McKenzie, yeah.
Yes, and they took it to the extreme.
Yeah, I was trying to be sarcastic, and it became the biggest success on SCTV, really.
Right, and to this day, I mean, I'm here in California, and I'll be meeting someone for the first time, and I go, oh, you're from Toronto, excellent, eh? Let's have a beer.
Exactly.
So that thing never dies.
Now, well, tell me about the band Skylark.
Well, Skylark, actually, some of your David Foster fan listeners might know that was David Foster, who's from Vancouver. that was his first band, and I'm not sure whether they had a record deal originally in the U.S. or not, or whether the tune Wildflower just became a hit in Canada and then maybe got licensed everywhere else. But anyway, it wasn't actually a song that Foster wrote, but you can certainly hear his hand in it. It's a beautiful arrangement, and Donnie Gerard, the lead singer, was, a great lead singer. So it was one of those kind of one-off 70s singles that we're talking about, but of course had the seeds of a great career in it.
Yeah, if it sounded abrupt as I segued into that, toss it out there. I mean, it's a band with Canadian roots, and we were talking about the Canadian content thing, and it just so happens that Brass Transit covered a Skylark song, the one you mentioned. So I want to pause a minute and listen to it. This was originally released in 1972 in the Skylark version. So let's check out the 2014 Brass Transit interpretation of the Skylark song Wildflower.
She's faced the hardest times you could imagine, and many times her eyes fought back the tears. And when her youthful world was about to fall in, each time her slender shoulders bore the weight of all the fears and the sorrow no one hears, still rings in midnight silence in her ears. Let her cry, for she's a lady. Let her dream, for she's a child. Let the rain fall down upon her. She's a free and gentle flower growing wild. Be careful how you touch her, for she'll awaken, and sleep's the only freedom that she knows. And when you walk into her eyes, you won't believe the way she's always paying for a debt she never owes. And the silent wind still blows, but only she can hear, and so she goes. Let her cry, for she's a lady. Let her dream, for she's a child. Let the rain fall down upon her. She's a free and gentle flower growing wild. And if by chance I should hold her, let me hold her for a time. And if allowed just one possession, I would pick her from the garden to be mine. Let her cry, for she's a lady.
Yeah, well, that's a great version of a great song. One question I had was, how do they handle artists like Neil Young, or people that were, Canadians but were out of the country making hits? Did that count as Canadian content, or?
It actually did. So if you were somebody like Neil Young or Gordon Lightfoot or Anne Murray or Joni Mitchell, and you were Canadian and you already had a career well underway in 1971 when they brought in the Canadian content legislation, you got a nice little shot in the arm domestically, because the easiest thing in the world was to say, oh, you want us to play more Canadian music? Okay, we'll play these songs that our audience feels safe with, and we'll just, play the crap out of these songs that have been hits over the last 5 years.
You mentioned there was this other thing where Canadian bands would cover American hits. So they could say, okay, well, I don't know, Sarah Smile is a hit. Let's do a version of it so they'll play ours instead of Hall & Oates. Was that going on too?
Yeah, there was a little bit of that. I mean, I can think of a few examples. There's even a Chicago one. They had a song on Chicago 8 called Any Way You Want, which was a real, strong, good poppy tune, good hook, but it wasn't one of the singles from the Chicago album. But almost as soon as that album was out, somebody in Toronto cut it. Charity Brown, who did that, I think, more than once, sort of covering an American tune and getting the jump on it. And that became, I'm sure it wasn't a hit outside of Canada, but it sort of got the little shot in the arm from the CanCon rules.
You can't blame them for trying. I mean, the opportunity was there.
No, and back in those days, and it's not strictly a Canada thing, but there was a lot of times there'd be a hot new tune, and there'd be a couple of bands who were going to put it on their next record, and it would literally be a race down to the wire to see who could get it on the streets first, get it in the first music meeting at a radio station, because once that happened, then all other versions were considered covers,
Right.
So it actually was a big deal. The turnaround time was sometimes a matter of days when people were trying to get the jump on other artists.
Yeah, I can imagine it'd be a race. And let's, be sure to mention that this isn't like a charity thing. There were a lot of great Canadian artists and bands. You mentioned Gordon Lightfoot, Anne Murray. I'm thinking Guess Who, BTO, Rush. It's not like, there was a lot of stuff that was worthy all on its own merit.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, sort of a future West Coast type artist was Gino Vanelli, who came out of Montreal at the time.
Yep, absolutely. Another point you make in the book is that a lot of hits in the early 70s were remakes of songs that predated the Beatles, like The Locomotion and Puppy Love. You included a very comprehensive and detailed chart showing the artist and date of all these various remakes and the original versions, and there are more than you might think. And I never would have made that connection before. It was just a little bit more random and scattered in my mind until you neatly summarized it that way. It was as if the public's depression over the loss of the Beatles motivated them to sort of pretend like the Beatles never happened, and just sort of relive the pre-Beatle era. And speaking of Puppy Love, I find it interesting that the public was cool with having hits by prepubescent lead singers like Michael Jackson and Donny Osmond, who were talented kids, but their voices hadn't changed, and they had plenty of older brothers standing on stage with them whose voices had. You don't really hear that anymore today.
No, it's a funny thing that it seemed like in all those bubblegum bands, especially the family bands, it was always the youngest kid or at least the youngest band member, who was the lead singer. And you got Michael Jackson out there at age 9 or 10 going, "Come on, girl, show me what you can do."
Yeah.
Like, what would you know about that, kid?
And he's got 4 older brothers who are like practically adults, probably thinking, how come I'm not doing this song? In the case of the Osmonds, Merrill Osmond sang a lot of songs too. Toss him a token song, for the little cute pinup teen idol guy for the girls. But at least, if you're talking about a hit on the radio, you really want to hear, was it Sweet and Innocent? One of those Donny Osmond songs, he hit some high notes in that thing, and I'm thinking, sing it in a lower key and have your older brother do it, man.
Well, somebody liked it.
Oh, yeah, well, I know, but the thing is that the little girls who were buying it weren't buying it as much for the song as they thought Donnie was cute, So I'm saying give them cute Donnie, but let's bring it down, to that so that the dogs aren't, taking notice.
Right. Yeah, there was a story of one station. I forget what part of the U.S. it was in. You might even remember because you've looked at the book more recently than I, but played Puppy Love for some insane amount of time without stopping, and people were going crazy.
That could be torturous, yeah.
Yeah, there were death threats,
Well, since this was my own personal era, when I saw all the various song titles on the written word on the page, about 85% of the time, I could instantly hear the song in my head. But of course, I didn't know all of them. So when you guys were researching the hits of the early 70s, did you discover many tunes that you missed the first time around?
Well, I got to say we're pretty sad music nerds, so we knew most everything. The only time when we would run into something was the odd time we'd be surprised that something that was maybe big in England and spilled over to Canada but wasn't a U.S. hit. And then the flip side of that was occasionally we would find something that was a big hit in the U.S. that was more of an R&B or soul tune that hadn't broken through in Canada. You'd hear like as far as we knew, the Spinners had 5 hits, but they had 12 hits, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that always makes me think of a situation with Paul McCartney and Mull of Kintyre, where it was like the record-selling hugest single ever in the UK, and Americans were like, no thanks.
Yeah, it's funny. And, what's funny is, I don't know, maybe it's all the Irish and Scottish in English Canada, but that tune was huge in Canada, too, and it's the only other territory that McCartney ever plays that song in is Canada, and he always gets a pipe band to come up and play bagpipes with him and stuff. But the thing is that even in a global sense, pop music hadn't gotten it down to a science yet. So there was still room for stuff that was big regionally or big in one territory for one reason or another, and it didn't have to be number one in 45 countries. It could just be big where it was, and good for them.
Yeah, it makes me think of Tommy James. I think at Hanky Panky or one of those ones was like a number one hit in a particular city, like Chicago or New York or Philly or something. And then later, a year or two later, it was the single we all knew. But yeah, you would have those regional hits.
Yeah, we got lots of Steely Dan fans listening. Haitian Divorce is one of their biggest UK hits. Wasn't even a single in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting how that works. You wouldn't know that unless you venture out of your own country, or you just happen to be the type of person who likes to research these things. I know that in some of the traveling I've done in other countries, I was in Egypt, and on the bus ride through the canal there and on into Cairo, they were playing some Pink Floyd, Momentary Lapse of Reason that had just come out. And it's odd thinking that people in Egypt listen to Pink Floyd. And then we were coming back through the border into Israel. We were being searched or whatever, and Santana Moonflower was playing. And I would have never thought that anything, even a deep cut from Santana, somebody over in, the border between Israel and Egypt would be listening to it. But of course, that's, my own lack of vision, because of course people in South Africa are listening to Steely Dan, and people in India are listening to, Yoko Ono. I don't know. But, like this is what I mentioned earlier about Americans always, probably because a lot of the music originates here, so we probably think, oh, well, we're it,
Yeah, you think of it as yours, which is only natural. But, it turns out music is pretty damn portable, especially when it's like Santana Moonflower. There's a lot of instrumental stuff on there, so there's not even a language barrier with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, good point, yeah.